the trick, which is what the services are trying to come up with now, is to work out where the significant areas of breakthrough are likely to occur. So we all know it's something to do with robotics. We all understand that drones are robotics, the Tempest program, the new GCAP and so on, the new air superiority ideas for the Navy, again, to have robotic ships. We all know that's the future for sixth generation weapons. The question is, where would robotics make the biggest difference? And is there a way in which robotics actually allow you to concentrate your energies elsewhere? At the moment, that isn't true, because we talk about drones, but I mean, drones don't allow you to have fewer people on the battlefield because somebody's got to control the drones. But this is where I think we are on the edge of a real military revolution. When drones become really linked to AI, then with large areas, they will become effectively autonomous weapon systems. And one person may be the human in the loop who is looking after 1,000 drones, 10,000 drones. The area below 5,000 feet could be an autonomous battlefield area with one person or a small team of people responsible for it. But the drones working with AI will work out their own strategies, they'll work out their own targets, and they will attack them. Now, that hasn't happened yet, but we are not far away from that revolution. And in a sense, your job as a minister is to try to navigate the areas where would that sort of thing, I'm giving you one, I think, big example, AI and drones, where would that make the most difference? And where can then you put scarce resources to develop that and be ahead of the game in trying to work that through? And Britain has made sincere efforts to do that on the basis of a constrained budget. I mean, intellectually, I've always thought Britain is pretty good at making these judgments. The problem is, can we follow it up with enough investment to actually bring it to fruition in time? The answer to that is not quite, but nevertheless, we're pretty good on the scientific side and the technological side of all of that.
So, Hamish, like most Western militaries, we're in the process of recapitalising our army here in the UK. And that recapitalisation really looks like the army of the 1990s, just with more sophisticated platforms, but fundamentally it's the same force design. Is there a danger that by the time Challenger 3, the British new main battle tank, and Boxer, the armoured fighting vehicle, are in service, mid-2030s, that the nature of the land warfare will have changed so fundamentally that we've recapitalised and bought an entirely obsolete force design?
That's a great question. I mean, yes and no. I mean, you really put your finger on the big challenge of military procurement that you'll know better than all of us, of course, that because it takes so long, things will be out of date. I mean, I look at the Port Down have developed this laser for knocking down drones called Dragonfire. But we understand it's not going to be in place for sort of another 4 years. If it was in place today, absolutely it would be game changing. So they're in the challenge. I think really at the root of it, of what we're seeing in Ukraine at the moment, is what we call concept of operations, how you actually use the stuff. And that is failing, I think, to keep up with technology. When we look at an area that I've expert in and written a lot about is, Russian tactical nuclear weapons, for instance. Their CONOPS are really based in the 70s and 80s when intelligence, surveillance, target acquisition was as it was then. As it is now means that, the Russians can barely, light up a launcher with its tactical nuclear weapons without us knowing about it virtually before the launcher operators themselves. So I think that is a really key element. The other element that that Mike alluded to, one of the challenges in this sort of as technology goes forward, we know that the key to being successful in land operations is combined arms maneuver with the support of the air and elsewhere. But that takes a heck of a lot of training. And I think one thing that you and your successors need to think about, going back to your original question, is are we going to have the right army in future? Is, are we going to be able to have the sort of follow-on echelons that are trained to conduct the warfare that we want? If we look at Ukraine at the moment, we know that the Russian professional army was killed or wiped out in the first year of the battle. To a degree, the same with the Ukrainians. What we're seeing now on the front line is very inexperienced Russian conscripts who can do little more than sort of get out of the trench and charge the enemy. And that might well be the same, for the Ukrainians too. And for ourselves, the size our army is at the moment, if we did get involved in a land war in Europe again, we must accept that our first echelon will last weeks, maybe months. But what about the follow-on? The war that Michael and you and I are talking about now is not something you can learn off the back of a fag packet in half an hour or so. So your question, will Ajax and Boxer be right in 10 years' time? I am sure they will. It'll be the concept of operations. And going back to my own area, tanks. Tanks are over 100 years old now and still going strong. They haven't fundamentally changed. They're still a metal box with a gun and tracks. So I think it's all about how you use them, and technology must be balanced about people being able to exploit it to its degree. But I go back to my original comment. At the end of the day, you still do need that mass to be able to prevail.
So I think that
both sides are working with the second echelon forces now, aren't they? In Ukraine, both sides are fighting with the second echelon forces, and it goes back to the old idea that I think Patrick Sanders, the present CGS of the chief of the army, who's stepping down now, he always makes the point. He said that wars are started by professional armies and they're finished by citizen armies, whether it's conscript or a recruited army, a professional army who is volunteers. Eventually, big wars are finished by citizen armies. Professionals start them, citizens finish them, because that's the nature of warfare. Anything other than expeditionary operations, of which we've conducted for the last 30 odd years, are different. But a war where somebody has to prevail and some sort of national mobilization has to take place have to be finished by second or even third echelon forces.
Look, you're both entirely right about the requirement of generating follow-on forces. It leads me to want to ask you two questions, actually. The first is, when you talk to NATO senior generals, admirals, air marshals, they will tell you, when you say, well, is the war in Ukraine how a NATO war with Russia would translate? Does it just come down, ultimately, to both sides' ability to absorb a body count, an attritional battle? And the NATO generals, admirals, air marshals all say with enormous confidence, no. NATO would fight this war in an entirely different way. Now, I can see how a first echelon force would fight in an entirely different way, a force that is trained in peacetime over decades and is equipped with the most sophisticated things that you're able to buy very deliberately when supply chains are unconstrained. But once that first echelon fight is over, if not decisive, does even NATO come back to that attritional, just who can keep it going longest fight that we're seeing between the Ukrainians and the Russians now? I'll come Michael first.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right, James. That the answer is that your follow-on forces, your second echelon, have got to be sufficiently trained reservists that they can pick up the combined arms requirements that Hamish is talking about as it were naturally. If they can't do that, and at the moment it's NATO forces don't have the sort of reserves that could really provide ready second echelon forces, then of course you're in a problem. When your first echelon forces are exhausted or can't do any more, if you can't follow on with second echelon forces who can take up the baton in the same way, then you've got a problem. And of course, that's exactly what happened in the Second World War. The first echelon forces were exhausted and finished by the end of 1940. The second echelon forces, the conscript army that then came together, was not very good until 1943-44. It wasn't ready until then. And that's why I often say 1942 was a dreadful year in the Second World War. And we're in that 1942 year now in Ukraine, that in fact, politically, the balance of forces moved significantly against the Axis powers in 1941. But it wasn't felt until the end of 1942. And so although it was clear that the Allies would win the war eventually, by December 1941, once America came into the war and Russia had changed sides and was fighting Germany, that meant that the Germans were always going to lose, the Japanese were always going to lose. But 1942 was a dreadful year because that was the era in which the follow-on forces were not ready. And it wasn't until 1944 that the follow-on forces were able then to behave like a professional army. And even then, it was tough going.
For the latest in geopolitics and future episodes of Superpowers, subscribe to our YouTube channel. Thanks for watching.